coming up on the show, I've got author and activist Arno Michaelis. And Arno is a former white supremacist who's done a complete 180 and now helps people leave hate organizations and extremist organizations. And this is obviously going to be a little bit of a departure from my usual interviews because I've had a lot of musicians and entertainment people on. But I have had some authors on the show in the past, and I'd really love to do more episodes like this one. So we're going to delve into Arno's story, and then I get his opinions on a lot of topical things going on right now with our media, politics, and race. And now these are just two men's opinions, and they don't represent everyone's view. And you may agree with some of the things we say, and you may disagree with some of the things that we say. But I think you'll find the conversation educational and very interesting. I know I did, and we barely scratched the surface on some of these topics. So trigger warning. We talk about some very serious things, adult topics here, so listen at your own discretion. Well, please welcome Arno Michaelis to the Chuck Shoot podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Chuck. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, this is exciting. I've read, I just finished your second book. I read both your books and some overlapping things in both of them, but there's definitely in the second one, the gift of our wounds, I believe it's called, right?
Yeah.
So the second one, there's like, you go into more detail with some other things, and they're both just really fascinating books. People should definitely check them out. So I'm wondering if for what we can do is maybe just kind of do like an abbreviated version of your life story to kind of explain to the audience kind of where you're coming from.
Sure. So today I'm best described as a storyteller, and I do that mainly in speaking engagements, also a good amount of consulting and educational stuff. I work a lot of corporate sector things, but also do stuff in middle schools, high schools. I work with law enforcement at all levels. And the main focus of my storytelling is to connect human beings and help people see that we have a lot more in common than different. And I do that because I believe it's the most effective means of combating violent extremism. And everything I do is informed by my past as a violent extremist. From 1987 to 1994, I was involved in white power skinhead groups. I was a leader and an organizer of those groups, as well as a lead vocalist for a white power metal band that was very popular at the time. And the harm that I've done back then is something that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. And really, it drives me to try to bring about a world where people don't commit that kind of harm and again, see themselves in others and see others in themselves.
Yeah. So is this your full-time thing? Are you still doing the IT stuff as well, or?
No, I moved on from IT. It was kind of a gradual phase out kind of thing. I was an independent IT consultant, so being my own boss, I was able to make a living while kind of developing a career and really a purpose as a activist and as a peacemaker. So I went public with my story about being a former white nationalist on the MLK holiday of 2010. And that kind of marked the new phase of my life. I started doing IT independently in 2001. So they overlap by about 3-4 years. And nowadays, the only IT I do is for myself, pretty much.
Okay. So this is your full-time thing. So if we go back a little bit with your story, it's so interesting because I think people have these stereotypes of white nationalists or white supremacists and how they became the way they became. But I know you had some trouble as a child, but relatively kind of a normal childhood. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. It is an interesting point to make because as you said, a lot of people, if they see someone in the Ku Klux Klan or a neo-Nazi, they think you can think a range of things. A lot of people think, well, that person's just a monster and society would be better off if they weren't around. And you can't blame anybody for feeling that way. But a lot of people would also assume that someone mixed up in that kind of thing was like taught to think that way by their parents, and or came from a really rough background with a lot of adverse childhood experiences. And it's been my findings working in the field of counterviolent extremism internationally for over a decade that in most cases that's true. To put it very simply, hurt people. And I've never seen an instance where someone who had a good sense of who they are and their own value as a person was moved to hate and hurt other people. The hate comes from trauma, and it comes from suffering. So I have a lot of colleagues in this space. We all call ourselves formers, as in former violent extremists, and not just former white nationalists. I have a lot of friends who are former jihadis. One of my closest friends is a former Antifa from Denmark, and him and I would have tore each other limb from limb 30 years ago, but now we're best of friends.
Wow.
And in every instance, talking with these guys, you hear about their childhood trauma, which in most cases was a lot more egregious than mine. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. My parents were together. They both loved me very much. They let me know that at every turn. But my father's alcoholism put a lot of pressure on my mom. We were literally living beyond our means the whole time I grew up. And my dad did more drinking than working all too often. And my mom would have times have to work two jobs to keep the lights on and the bills paid. And and her relationship with my dad sucked. My dad wasn't abusive, but when you're partying all the time and your wife's trying to keep things running, the financial stress drives a lot of arguments and stress in the household. And so I just grew up seeing my mom suffer, and that was my pain point. But
because you didn't suffer, right? You said your dad was a happy drunk, and so you were like,
I always call him a fun drunk.
yeah.
He was, and he still is. My dad is a certified gun nut, and we had a gun room in our basement where not just a gun safe, he had a whole room for his guns, and we had a pistol range actually in our basement. And as soon as I could hold a pistol, we were down there shooting it, and quite often at like midnight on a night when mom is working two jobs.
Weren't you like lighting fireworks off and stuff? Like,
fireworks were a big thing. There was many fireworks incidents, but the one that comes to mind was, I think I was in 6th or 7th grade, and I had a buddy spending the night, and my dad had just come back from up north Wisconsin with a huge cache of illegal fireworks like bottle rockets and Roman candles, things like that. And we're all lighting them off in the backyard. And my dad has his buddy over, and they're both like rip roaring, falling down stupid drunk. And I don't even know who started it, but somebody aimed a Roman candle at another guy, and real soon it broke out into me and my buddy against my dad and his buddy. And seeing as that we were kids and very nimble and sober, we were literally kind of running circles around them, blowing them up with bottle rockets and Roman candles. And it was
that's good. Well, and so isn't that it's interesting to hear you talk about your childhood, because wasn't there a point where your school tested you and said, hey, this kid's really bright, you need to let him expand his wings, and like maybe your parents let you have a little too much freedom? Because it sounds like you kind of went crazy for a while.
that you could definitely make a case for that. A lot of times when I talk about my childhood, a lot of people are like, you just need a good ass whooping is what you needed. And
there is that theory. Yeah.
I don't believe violence is a way of teaching anybody anything, especially not children. But
right, but so maybe some more stricter boundaries and
exactly. Yeah, I definitely think that could have been beneficial in my childhood. It was actually a pediatrician who told my mom that what a gifted genius I am, and that I should be allowed to run amok and explore my gifted geniusness. But and I think my dad, being a kind of a wild, smart, gifted genius guy himself, and not real uh, comfortable with like rules and boundaries put on him, it translates. You get
Mm-hmm.
your parents raise you as who they are, and that combined with just my personality type and my that whole nature nurture combination,
Right.
it created this real kind of wild kid. But it was the suffering that kind of sent it in a dark direction.
Right. So, because you didn't grow up with hate. In fact, I think I read about you going to like a Run DMC concert in the 80s, which is awesome. And you were involved with like, you were hanging out with like the breakdancing kids. And so then explain this story to my audience, because this kind of seems like, if I would say there's one moment that kind of like got you angry, it was this moment where you got bullied on the playground or whatever.
Yeah, so it was about sixth grade for me, which was early 1980s. And I was also really kind of, to this day I'm kind of adverse to trends and whatnot, but I did often find myself at the forefront of trends, and I did in my tween years, in that I was one of the first like suburban white kids to get into hip hop and black culture and whatnot. And I was into breakdancing, and I did see Run DMC in 1984, I believe. Saw Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. I was really like super into that scene, and then got kind of discouraged when it became trendy. But the incident that you're talking about was, I believe, happened in seventh grade. In that I had my little breakdance crew, and we'd like kind of dip out of the suburb and head into the city on Saturday nights and go do breakdance battles at a roller rink. And the fashion at the time for, if you had like white people hair, was having a little rat tail in the back. And so I had that rat tail going. It was probably about 6 inches long. I dipped it in peroxide and had a little, blonde streak at the end. And yeah, it was pretty fashionable. And I was, throughout my life, this has always kind of been the case. Like, very few people don't know who I am, as far as, in whatever circle I'm in. And in school, like, everybody knew who I was, and they either loved me or hated me. There was very few people that had like a neutral opinion on me.
Hmm.
And I was an asshole. I was a bully since I was a little kid. I definitely, again, like I said, I don't think violence is the way to teach things, but at the same time, I kind of had this coming. And what came was as I'm kind of prancing around school with this breakdance crew and getting the attention of a lot of girls. The whole like jock scene, were it really kind of like getting fed up with me. And I had bullied a few of those guys before, and at the same time, like, I played football with them. I was always kind of able to traverse all these various cliques in school. Like, I wasn't a jock, but I played sports and I knew all the jocks. I wasn't like a full-on nerd, but I was still into nerdy things, and I hung out with the nerds. That would later go on to like the punk scene and whatever. But in seventh grade, these jocks were pretty sick of my bullshit, and they decided they're going to teach me a lesson. So they all kind of sidled around until they were surrounding us on the playground, and I didn't really notice because me and my guys are all doing our breakdance ciphers. And all of a sudden, the jocks all jumped on me, and I realized one of them had a scissors. And so it became this really violent kind of scramble of me trying to fight off, I don't know how many guys, but ultimately they got my hands separated from my tail, and one of them took a scissors out, snipped it off, and I remember he's like holding it in the air like a trophy, like, I got it. And then they all kind of disappeared, and I looked up, and all my guys had disappeared also.
Hmm.
And I was I was utterly like humiliated, and felt violated. It was really probably the most traumatic moment I had endured in my life to that point. And a lot came out of that, and one of them being that I felt like kind of betrayed by all my breakdancing crew. I don't know that I really put like a racial spin on it at that point,
Mhm.
but I think it would be fair to say that there may have been some like underlying feelings after that, like, yeah, these guys are supposed to have my back and they didn't. I don't know that I consciously extrapolated that onto to all Afro Americans,
Right.
but I think later on it may have been some of that surfaced. But really, the big driver for me getting involved with white nationalism was just because it pissed people off.
Right, because isn't that what happened? So then you started getting into punk, and then that was what punk was all about. Was just it's not like you went to join white supremacy right after that, but it was like the punk movement was all about rebelling, and that's what you were drawn to. It was more about pissing people off, and that was a way to piss people off was with swastikas and racism and things. Because it wasn't that you really believed the propaganda at least at that point, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. You nailed it. It was definitely like, to me, punk was about breaking shit and pissing people off.
Yeah.
Like I wanted the most drastic means of lashing out and repulsing civil society that I could dig up. And to give you an idea, like as a punk rocker, there was one summer at summer camp, I met some kid from Milwaukee who was a big headbanger, and he was like into Slayer and Venom and Exodus, and I turned him on to like Agnostic Front and the Cro-Mags and Fear, and like we're all like, oh, we're both like really delighted at our kind of exchange of heavy music. And I again, like I love Slayer just because like how fast and hard they were, and just like the adrenaline rush you get from it. But even that, the guys in the band, from what I know, were very like tongue in cheek with all the Satanism stuff. And I like got into that also. I wasn't like, oh yeah, Satan's a real thing, I'm gonna go sacrifice a dead baby or something. But it was like, wow, people get really pissed off if you put an upside down cross on you. And actually, one of my first tattoos was a big upside down cross that said "Amen" above it. And this is when I was a punk rocker. And I also, to match in shop class, I made a big upside down cross earring about this big, which was short lived. It got ripped off in a mosh pit a couple months later. But that it just kind of it shows this pattern of like, oh, here's a way to really piss people off. Put an upside down cross around. Ooh, this is awesome. Oh, you think an upside down cross pisses people off? Try a swastika. Wow. Now they're really pissed off. And so that was kind of the progression that led me to white nationalism. It was really more for the shock value than the ideology itself initially.
Yeah. And then you started drinking at 14, and you said that was like pouring gasoline on the fire. That just made you more destructive and lash out. And then didn't you start to like, you kind of like seeking out fights and things, right?
Yeah, so I did start drinking when I was 14. It was actually a aforementioned heavy headbanger kid I was drinking with. There was appropriately enough, there's like a graveyard in Milwaukee where the kids would go party, and so here we are out there, him in his Slayer jacket, and me in my Agnostic Front, ripped up T-shirt, and I think we had like an 8-pack of Lowenbrow or something, and I had like probably 3-4 beers and passed out. But it was definitely like, as soon as I started drinking, I went from zero to alcoholic. I come from long lines of alcoholism on both sides of my family.
Mhm.
So I was kind of genetically predisposed to, as soon as I started drinking, it was like, boom, alcoholism. And I had been violent since I was a little kid. So violence is something I was very accustomed to. And you add the alcohol to the violence, and then yeah, I would go out and get in fights in the street. I I'm a big dude, and like people are to this day find my physical presence kind of intimidating, but like, and I was as a kid also, but I've never been very coordinated or like very fast. So when I go out to get in fights, I get my ass kicked as often as I kick anybody else's ass. But it was really like not about winning the fight. It was just about experiencing the violence.
Okay. So you're hanging out with these punks. So then it's just kind of like you gradually start meeting more people who are more deep into this like white nationalist movement. And then you start like living with them, right?
Yeah, I actually had a friend named Jane who was kind of like OG punk queen of the Milwaukee scene, and she started driving a tour bus for the Cheetah Chrome motherfuckers, and she drove this bus like all from the Midwest to and it was just a big van. And she gets out to the East Coast, and by the time she's out there, like Cheetah Chrome were like real live filthy stinking punk rockers, and just like she couldn't stand and being in a van with these guys who never bathed and like were just like really living the whole disgusting crusty punk ideal. And so she bailed from the tour in New York. She met some like kind of, so a lot of things that a lot of people understand is like the whole skinhead thing from the get-go wasn't necessarily racist. Like the original skinheads came about in the late 60s, early 70s in the UK, and it was more of like a reaction to the kind of mod scene. So like if you see old like videos of the Who or the Rolling Stones, and they have this flashy hair and clothes, and they're kind of posh and pretty boy, like skinhead counterculture was a reaction to that. They were like working class kids who had nothing. They were all football hooligans. They shaved their heads so you couldn't pull their hair in a fight, and they listened to reggae. And like they included like Pakistani immigrants and immigrants from the West Indies among them. And it wasn't until the late 70s that actual fascist party in Britain called the National Front started seeing the potential for like a brown shirt among the skinheads. So they started telling these skinheads, like, yeah, the reason why you don't have a job is because of that Pakistani immigrant. He's not your friend. He's a problem. He's got to go. Enough of them bought into it that this whole offshoot of the skinhead counterculture came about that was like blatantly racist. And as I was kind of progressing through the punk scene, Jane meets some of these kind of nationalist but not racist skinheads in New York. She adopts the kind of look and the boots and braces and what's not, starts making her way back. She comes through Chicago, connects with the Chicago area skinheads, which to my knowledge were the first racist skinhead crew in the United States. They play Screwdriver for her, which is like one of the seminal skinhead bands. And it just like, that kind of took her by storm. And she brought the tape up to Milwaukee, played it for me and for her then boyfriend, later husband, Pat O'Malley. And we were just right away, we're like, this is awesome, man. Like, where has this been all our lives? This is what we got to get into. And at the time, there was already kind of a like apolitical skinhead kind of mass growing in the Milwaukee scene. And when you added Screwdriver to the mix, it caused like a bunch of us said, okay, we're white power skinheads. We're the real skinheads. Everybody else are baldies. And the other guys were like, yeah, we're not Nazis. You guys are the fake skinheads. And
Yeah.
there was a bunch of fighting and whatnot. But that's basically how it all started to splinter.
So was there somebody that kind of, for lack of a better word, was kind of like your mentor as a white supremacist that like indoctrinated you? Because I know that you would later indoctrinate people with books and things. And like, what kind of literature did they get? Did they give you Mein Kampf or like what? I don't know what did they? How did they like? What did they teach you? It's just.
Yeah, it's well, and there definitely was like entry points like that. And it's funny because I've been a voracious reader my entire life, and I had already read a ton of books by the time I was 14. And so when I get into like, I'm a neo-Nazi now, I got to read Mein Kampf. And we stole an English translation of it from the library, and I couldn't even get through half of it because it was just so poorly written. And it was just like, this isn't like doing a whole lot to like make me into this ideology.
No, it wasn't like you read that book and it was like, oh, this is so inspiring.
Yeah, not at all. It was, the book was like a miserable failure and like get me to buy into the ideology. But what did happen was we our first effort at like outreach was like, we're gonna have a hotline, and we arranged some kind of voicemail thing where people could call and we'd put a message on there, or some racist rant, and then they would leave a message for us. And most of the messages were really hostile, and we were actually using the address to our dwelling as our like mailing address, like for more information. right to blah blah blah. And we had the address of where we lived, and so we started getting bricks through the windows, and we're like, oh, and again, this is just like kind of the whole thing works. Like you go out and you offend all these people, you say all this horrible shit, you do things mainly to repulse people, and then when they react as you are trying to provoke, then you turn it around and go, oh, we're persecuted, we can't even like talk about how much we love our race without our windows being broken, and so now we're oppressed because
Right.
we're basically seeing the effects of our actions, really. But as all this is happening, there was one particular guy in Milwaukee who, and it was like this old Polish guy from the South Side. We later met him in person, but he got a hold of us right away, and he's like, yeah, I think you guys are doing a great thing there, but you got to get a post office box. You can't you can't use your home address. And we're like, okay, well that's good advice. So that was one of the first things we did there. And then it was through people like him that we were turned on to literature like by George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder of the American Nazi Party in the 60s. And Rockwell, who was later assassinated by one of his own guys, which is a very common thing amongst organizations that revolve around hate and violence, go figure. But Rockwell was really smart, and he had like a really wicked, biting sense of humor, and he used satire in a lot of his writing. And his books I thought were great. I was just like, wow, yeah. And you can liken Rockwell to like one of today's pundits, who has a show and just shoots zingers at the other side all day and makes them look stupid. And he was kind of along that vein, although in a very blatantly racist, anti-Semitic way. So it was kind of these old guard Nazis and Klansmen who would see us, making noise after decades of relative quiet in the white nationalist scene. Here, all of a sudden, there are these young skinheads who are, burly street fighting guys. They want to shake things up, and so a lot of these guys were really excited to see us emerge. But the ones who there were some who tried to waltz in and just assume command of us, and they got their asses beat along with everybody else. The smart ones would just kind of connect with us from an arm's length, and provide us with literature and things like that. The ones who we had ongoing relationships were the ones who were smart enough not to try to boss us around.
Are these books, a lot of these books and things that you guys read, are these books banned now, or are they still out there somehow? Because there's still these organizations out there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know that the books are banned. I hope they're not. I'm not one for banning books, and I do hold the First Amendment in very high regard. But I would imagine it'd be harder to get them. Well, I don't know, because you'd probably get copies online or what. But yeah, there's a whole reading list of beyond the writings of Rockwell. There was stuff by like William Pierce and other like more contemporary neo-Nazi type guys who had done a lot of writing, and those were the things that we kind of gobbled up.
It's just so weird because you think so many things are being banned that are even like fringe racist or things like that. And then also I remember reading your book, you go to one of these organizations, a party, and the guy is wearing a full Nazi uniform. I'm like, where does he even get that? I mean, it's just so bizarre to me.
Yeah, it was, a lot has certainly changed between the late 80s and now. A lot hasn't changed. The core belief of white nationalism is fear and separatism. It just saying well, because we have less melanin in our skin, we're better and at war with everyone else, and at the same time threatened by everyone else. The anti-Semitism is a really strong common thread. I recently worked with a brilliant woman Ali Furvig at Ocean City College, who runs the Holocaust education effort there. And she had called anti-Semitism the oldest hatred. And I that really resounded with me. I think for thousands of years, Jews have been blamed for everything going wrong with the world, from droughts to the Black Plague up to COVID, and it's nothing new to blame Jewish people for whatever's going wrong in a person's life or in the world in general. Those things are all the same, but what is different to a degree is the look and the actual, like, what does a white nationalist look like nowadays versus what did one look like in the late 80s, and then versus what did one look like in the 60s and or the 30s in Germany or whatnot. But yeah, we did meet some guys in Michigan who fashioned themselves as like a new school SS unit, and I don't know if they got it from Army surplus stores or whatever, but they all had
bizarre.
like, yeah, they had like the straps and the armbands and the hats and all that, and the whole thing kind of struck me as kind of homoerotic. And I don't know how much going back, like back to Hitler's days. One of Hitler's early brown shirt guys was a guy named Ernst Röhm, who basically led the brown shirts to put Hitler in power. And then it was revealed that Ernst was a closeted homosexual, and he was executed because of it. And that's also a repeating theme. You see,
is that
people,
part of your the group that you were in? Were they anti homosexual as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We saw. So I was. You got to understand the context for this. This happens to be, I was like out at a meal in New York with a real diverse bunch of friends, and someone asked me a question like this, and I just like said the answer, and a server walks by hearing me say it, and like, what the So, like, if you ask if we were opposed to homosexuality, I'd say, yeah, we were. We believed that homosexuality was like a tool of the Jews to destroy the white race by keeping us from breeding and keeping us, making us into sissies and taking away our will to fight. And again, it's you blame like kind of a natural fact of human life, which is various expressions of gender and sexual identity, and you twist it and you make it part of this big conspiracy to kill you and everybody who looks like you. So that was how we viewed homosexuality, and what the result is you get people. I'm hopelessly like in the vaginas and whatnot, but I have a lot of gay friends who, talking with them, I understand what it's a really difficult experience to be closeted, to like not be able to express who you're attracted to. And I'm that's one thing that I'm really inspired by nowadays, in that's not a big deal. Whereas when I was in high school, it was just unthinkable for two guys to be walking down the hall holding hands or going to prom together. And nowadays, I've talked at schools where the principals like brag about, yes, we have openly gay couples walking down the hall holding hands. But going back to being closeted, we had a guy in our group who joined who was like really hateful and angry. He wanted to beat the shit out of people. He's constantly going off about faggots. And all of a sudden it's revealed that I forget what the reveal was, but it was somehow, somebody talked to someone who made out with him or something. And when we find out that this guy was gay, like he got the shit kicked out of him.
Wow.
And then he was kicked out of the group. And so that theme was also repeated in our group with a guy who was Jewish, who like joined the group, like vehemently hated Jews, and all of a sudden it turns out like, well, he was actually Jewish, and that's why. And he has this sense of self-loathing that he doesn't know how to process and how to deal with it, so he just like jumps into the self-loathing like 500% and actually joins a group that hates who he is. So,
right, and didn't you find out like midway through this organization that you're in that you're 1/16 Native American?
Yeah, that was
How do you don't get kicked out for that, or you
well
don't tell anybody, or
this yeah, first of all, I only told like a couple people, and what happened was it was Thanksgiving of '89, and I was at Thanksgiving dinner with a skinhead girlfriend, and I think I was 18 and she was like 19 or so, and we were both rip roaring drunk when we show up. Um, Thanksgiving was always a pretty dysfunctional event in my family. Typically, it would just be my mom and my grandma who were the only ones sober, and then uh, my dad, my aunt, my uncle, like they're all wasted. And in this context, I'm at the Thanksgiving dinner table going on about the white race and how we're all threatened and everybody's got to mobilize. And my mom kind of stops me and she's like, "Well, Mr. Nazi, did you know that your great grandpa Bordeaux was, Arcadian, and he was French Canadian Native American? So like you have Indian blood in you." And I was like, "That's not true. You're a liar." And I went stomping out of Thanksgiving dinner. Went back to this hovel that we lived in, and I locked myself in the bedroom with a case of really cheap beer and glass bottles. And I worked my way through the case until I got drunk enough to break one of the bottles and carve my wrist up with it. My girlfriend later like kicked down the door after I was passed out, and she had the presence of mind to bind my wound and stop me from bleeding out. And then the next day, I wrote a letter to like a big honcho in the white nationalist movement back then, and I basically said like I want to die, like my race is all I have. I can't believe that I'm not a pure-blooded Aryan white man and all this. And he wrote me back right away saying that I was a good pure-blooded Aryan white man, and that if I had a nosebleed, I'd lose my Indian blood, and that it shouldn't concern me, and that I should keep going fighting for the white race. And I kind of like kept that letter as like my pass. Like if anybody got in my face about it, but I did keep it pretty quiet. There was a couple older guys in the group that I was tighter with than anyone else, and I did kind of let them know about it after I had the letter, of course. And so I could be like, well, this happened, but I have this letter from Tom Metzger, and he says that I'm cool, so full speed ahead. The irony, the funny part of all of it is that a couple of years ago I got a 23andMe done, and I have absolutely zero indigenous people whatsoever.
I was gonna say, did you ever get the DNA test? Because now you can get those. Okay. So,
yeah,
but either way, there's so many fallacies with this with these theories. And one of the things that would really like, this is where like I'm out, because like you said that you could not watch football, like you couldn't watch Packer games, you couldn't listen to the Beastie Boys, you couldn't watch Seinfeld. Like, are you kidding me? Like, because I wondered that. I was like, how extreme are these organizations? Like, do they just think like, okay, well, white people are better than this stuff, but we can still, enjoy this culture, but we're better than that? But it's like, no, you weren't even allowed to enjoy the culture at all.
Well, and it's like what we say and what we do are two different things. But it was basically like the way nowadays you hear a lot of people use the phrase virtue signaling, which I'm not a big fan of. And it's ironic because most of the people who bitch about virtual signaling are virtue signaling themselves by saying, I don't virtue signal.
Yeah.
But you are virtue signaling by saying that. But it's an apt phrase when talking about this, because it's basically like, if I'm with a bunch of skinheads, the way that I show them how down I am is to like, oh, the Packers, that's part of the plot to destroy the white man. They want to dumb us all down so they can more easily oppress us by numbing our mind with these stupid sports teams that have black men and white men on the same team, like being friends with each other. It's all a plot to kill the white people. And the more like pissed off I am about it, and the more I bitch about it amongst this group, that's how I'm signaling how down for the cause.
You're virtue signaling within white supremacy. That's an interesting idea.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then of course on Sundays, like every chance I got, I'd sneak away from my guys and I'd like watch the Packer game real low, and I'd
It's so funny that you did that. You had to sneak to watch the Packers. That's so
it's
interesting.
ridiculous. And this would happen over and over again. There was a saying amongst in the white nationalist ideology where they'd say, if you look at the credits to a TV show or a Hollywood movie, it reads like a Tel Aviv phone book. And this kind of like plays into the conspiracy theory of like, oh, we know that Jews run Hollywood and Jews run TV, and everything that you see on TV and everything you see coming out of Hollywood, and this of course would extend to professional sports and music and whatever else, is all part of this Jewish plot to kill all the white people by diminishing our racial consciousness and not and like stopping us from organizing as a race to work for our common interests. Like this is all part of how they do that. I recall I was at like a paramilitary training thing in the Carolinas when I was 18, and we had a night off, and we were at a gas station where they had some movies for rent back in the day when you'd rent a VHS tape and things like that. And one of my all-time favorite movies I've ever seen is Blade Runner. And they had it there, and I'm like, oh, we got to get this movie, guys. Like, let's get this movie and watch it. And I really just wanted to get lost in the movie that night. And as soon as we pop it in, the guys I'm with are like, you know, Harrison Ford's a Jew, right? His real name's like Shlomo Rabinowitz, and he changed it, and he's a Jew, and they're a Jew, and everybody in this movie's a Jew. And I'm like, can't you just shut up and watch the movie? Like, this is
right.
But they couldn't. Like the whole time we're watching this movie, I'm hearing about it. We ended up having to turn it off, and then I got shit for that for like years later. Like, oh, Arno loves Jews because he loves Blade Runner, and I'm just like, at the time, like, I tried dancing around it, but
that's got to be so hard to avoid movies and sports and culture, the music. I mean, there's so much great stuff out there that's eclectic of so many different things. Totally. So besides that fallacy, then there's the other fallacy of like the real people that you interact with. You're working at this t-shirt company with minorities and stuff, and they're like really nice to you. But you're supposed to try to hate these people like because they're a minority, but like you're like they're really nice to you, even though they know you're a white supremacist.
Exactly. And that was really as difficult as it was to like bear my own glaring hypocrisy of enjoying Hollywood movies and sports and things like that. What really drove it home more than anything else is when I had actual interactions with other human beings who were people that I claimed to hate, who refused to play by my rules. And that's something that I think is really poignant, and I'm afraid it's getting lost way too often in today's discourse when we talk about racism. In that, in more irony, when I was a white nationalist and years into it, some like really hardcore guy who was like a terrorist basically, and saying, you know, we all need to just disconnect ourselves from our loved ones and start robbing banks and blowing things up. This guy told me that I had to read Sun Tzu's Art of War. And right away, I'm like, why would I read a book about, you know, racial slur against Asian people? And he's like, just read it. There's a lot of like really good tactical information in there about how to fight. And you need to understand that. And so I did read it back then. I didn't really get the value of the book. I reread it recently in the past few years. And in the book, there's all kinds of really smart tactical things, but one of them is basically like knowing yourself. If you know yourself and you know your enemy, you need not fear the result of 1,000 battles. If you know one or the other, you'll win half. If you don't know either, you won't win a single battle. And what I get from that is basically like controlling the rules of engagement. So I again, because I'm a big guy, I make this point if I'm talking to someone like Chuck, if you and I were to go into a steel cage and fight in an octagon,
you'd kick my ass.
Well, first of all, I have post-concussion syndrome, so I'd probably get a concussion if you look at me funny. But just going into the scenario, would you rather make the rules of that fight, or would you rather let me make the rules?
Right. I'd rather make the rules for sure.
You probably have a better chance of winning. You can say, well, Arno has to have his hands tied behind his back, or he can't, he can't do this or he can't do that. When you interact with someone, their attitude that they bring is like their attempt to set the rules of engagement. And when I was a white power skinhead, everything I did was meant to provoke hostility. I wanted people to hate me. I wanted people to swing at me. If I got my ass kicked, that was fine as long as it devolved to violence. Yet people like Afro-American coworkers, Latino coworkers, a lesbian supervisor, a Jewish boss, all of these people refused to let me make the rules of engagement. And instead they said, hey, I'm going to dictate our rules of engagement. And that is, this is how a human being treats another human being. You're hungry, I'm going to give you half of my sandwich. I don't care if you like me or hate me or what. I'm not going to sit here and watch a hungry person starve. And that happened when a Afro-American coworker gave me half his lunch because he saw me hungover, starving, collapsed in a heap in the corner of the break room. And again, there was no mistaking what I was about. Like, I had a shaved head, I had swastikas tattooed all over me. I was an outspoken racist. Anybody's going to know what I'm about. So that kind of kindness like blew all my bullshit out of the water. It basically like indicated how wrong I was, and it was a big factor leading up to me leaving.
Yeah. Well, and then tell this story too. I know you've told the story a million times, but the elderly black woman at the McDonald's, and this is like 3 months into you being in the white nationalism. And so you kind of had to keep this in the back of your mind for the 7 years you're in that organization. But yeah, tell my audience that story real quick.
It's funny. I've actually done talks where people, I don't know if there's lighters up, but they're like, "Woo, McDonald's story."
Oh, really?
Get requests for it.
Requests.
So
good story.
It is a good story. So I'm a couple months into this, and because I'm a gifted genius, I figured I'd get a swastika tattooed on this middle finger, the one that currently is the
So
V.
now it says love.
Yeah, now it says love. And I had this done by a guy.
Love wins. It says for the audience on audio only. He's got love wins on his fingers, like his fists.
That was tattooed by a guy that I helped to get out of the Ku Klux Klan in 2016. But underneath that V on my right hand, I had a swastika tattooed when I was 16, and that was specifically so when people would get in my face about me being a racist, I could show them that swastika and be like, "Yeah, what are you going to do about it?" Like that was so I could repulse people to the point of violence. And at this time, all I ate was ramen noodles, like the 10 for $1 brick kind. And I did that so I could have more drinking money. And because I'm a gifted genius. So the only day of the week I'd eat anything different was on payday, which was Wednesday, when I'd go get a Big Mac from McDonald's. And my first payday at this place, I go get my Big Mac, and I walk into this McDonald's, and there's this elderly black woman behind the counter, and she's got this beautiful smile that is just like shining like the sun for anybody who walks through that door. The sun shines on everybody. It doesn't care what color your skin is, how much money you got, don't got, skinhead, gangbanger, saint, whatever. It shines on everybody. And her smile was very much like that. And it was it made me very uncomfortable because I'm trying to hate black people, and here's this sweet old woman with this beautiful smile that just makes it very difficult to hate her. So I go order my food. I scurry out of there. A week goes by. I come in again. She remembers me this time. She remembers what I ordered. She's asked me about my day, talking about the weather, and I'm all the more uncomfortable. I get my food and I scurry out. After that between that payday and the next one, at Saturday night, I got that swastika tattooed. And so the next week when I walk in, I just freeze in the doorway, and I had this like involuntary sense of, I was like, I don't want her to see this tattoo.
You're ashamed.
I was ashamed of it, absolutely. Even though I got it to offend everybody who looks like her. When I walked in and saw her there, I froze in the doorway. I didn't want to offend her. I was ashamed of it, absolutely. And I actually sat there for a minute, like, doesn't anybody else work here? Like, you have to open somebody else and come to the counter. Nobody did. I for a minute, I'm thinking, like, where's the next closest McDonald's? But it was December in Wisconsin and freezing, and ultimately the siren song of the Big Mac prevailed, and I went up to the counter, and I'm thinking I'll just like keep my hand in my pocket and she won't see it, not thinking that I got to get my money out of my right hand pocket. So as I'm doing that, she sees the swastika, and she says to me the same way my grandma used to talk to me when I'd beat up my little brother. She goes, "What is that on your finger?" And and I would have said, "All right, that's the symbol of my people because I'm an Aryan white man fighting against the blah blah blah." But instead of saying that, I just like look. I couldn't even look her in the eye. I looked down at my steel-toed boots, and I was a good foot taller than her, but I felt like 6 inches high when she asked me, and I just said, "It's nothing." And when I looked back up and our eyes met, she said, She goes, "You're a better person than that. I don't think that's who you are." And I was just like, "Can I have my backpack, please?" And I got it. And I scurried out of there and I wolfed it down. I went home. I got drunk as fast as I could. I went out in the streets and I attacked the first person I could find, like just trying to put some distance between me and this singularity of humanity I had just experienced. And it didn't work ultimately, because even though this
Mm-hmm.
happened in the first couple of months of my 7-year involvement in white nationalism, it when a human being experiences something, it's part of their being from that day forward. You can't like erase it. You can't. If you could, there'd be no use for therapy. And so as hard as I tried to suppress this experience I had, it was still like I was unable to do so, and it took more and more energy. And that was a big factor in the exhaustion that built up ultimately to lead me out.
Well, and also I think some of your friends died. I mean, that's the ultimate. Well, you saw kind of the future of where this was going to go. You were either going to end up in jail or death, pretty much, right? You get shot or killed in a fight or something.
Yeah, I had in 1990 there was I always say a dear friend of mine, and at the same time, like you can't really have a true friendship when you're immersed in all this hate and violence. But the nature of friendship and the nature of, I think, love between human beings, it really like it can actually take root and happen even in those kind of circumstances. And so I had a really close friend, as close as we could be under the circumstances, that was exactly 1 year younger than me. And in 1990, he was out provoking hate and violence as I had taught him to do, when
Mm-hmm.
he got in a bar fight, and one of the guys in the fight came back with a pistol and shot at him from a half a block away with it was a 25 caliber pistol that would probably cost him $50, and on the best day you wouldn't be able to hit the broadside of a barn with it from that far. But on this day, just that one shot went through my friend's back, in between, and went right through his heart, and he died on the spot. um every year of my birthday now, I think about him and I think about who he would be today. But at the time, it just drove me further, like deeper into what we call the movement. It absolutely inflamed all of my hatred, all my violence, and kind of drove me to even up the level of activism that I was doing at the time. But in 1994, after my girlfriend and I had broke up and I'd become a single parent to my 18-month-old daughter, a second friend of mine was shot and killed in a similar scenario. And this was after a concert my band had played. And my friend who got killed in 94 was also lead vocals of another white power band. He had a couple little kids who grew up without their dad because he was out uh, looking for hate and violence, and he found it. And at that point, I had lost count how many friends had been incarcerated. So it was really like that kind of perfect storm that led me to finally walk away from it I think it was around April of 94.
Okay. And the daughter obviously was a big piece of that too. But so going back to that, like, would you, like, I don't understand, what is the ultimate goal of these organizations? Because I mean, it's just to convert as many people as they, because I think I heard you say in the second book something about we're going to like sending back people to where they came from. But like, if we think like Native Americans, like what was the plan with that? Because they're from America. So or I mean, was there other kinds of goals, or like, I'm just trying to think like, what's the big picture? I mean, they're scary organizations.
Right. It's vocalized a little different from organization to organization, but basically what all violent extremism revolves around are first of all oppression narratives, like our in group is oppressed by this evil out group, so we're gonna fight back with everything we got to stop this oppression. And then for what you're talking about now, they're driven by return narratives. So in the case of white nationalism, and again, this is all like completely erroneous from a historical point of view, but that we're going to make Europe white again. Okay, well, Europe was overrun by Huns, overrun by Mongols, and overrun by Moors throughout the history of that continent. And who knows, how many times in the tens of thousands of years before then. So this idea of like when Europe ever was white, like did that ever exist? That's debatable in the first place. The second point is if you could put your finger on a time when Europe was white, it was the Dark Ages. Like we were all burning each other as witches and fighting everybody 2 feet away from us and enslaving each other. It wasn't some Shangri-La where like, oh, we all look the same, so we're all going to live in this awesome whiter and brighter world. And that was actually the language that one of the groups I was involved with used. They called it the whiter and brighter world. And the idea was at some point the white race, again, whatever that is, that's also another thing that no one's ever been able to put their finger on to this day as to what the white race is or is not. But for the sake of argument, as the white race, as the movement defined it, would control the entire planet Earth, and simply by stopping supporting anyone who wasn't white, they would wither on the vine, so to speak. Like this idea that like without the white man feeding everyone and providing food and shelter and technology, that no one else could survive. And that was one take on a utopian white future that one particular group I was involved with had. But if you look at all of them, they're all going to be pretty similar. Like they want there was a lot of in the 80s, there was a lot of thing about a white homeland in the Pacific Northwest, where you're going to give us our white homeland, and if you don't give it to us, we'll take it. And that's what's going to happen. And you see separatists and nationalists have been doing that throughout history, if not like along racial lines, but along some national or ethnic or religious lines. So it's not a new thing, but it's never it's a false return narrative. As I pointed out, there was never a point when Europe was all white, even if you could say that it was a pretty miserable time. And then second of all, it really just flies in the face of biology and zoology, which is really plain as day. If you look at a rainforest or a coral reef or the mountains or whatever, any kind of ecosystem, the diversity is always the hallmark of the health of an ecosystem. So anytime you have an ecosystem where there is no diversity, you have an ecosystem that's in crisis, that's gonna it's gonna have a catastrophic failure and have to rebuild itself. And I believe human society is plainly included in that kind of dynamic.
Right. Well, and I think that's what makes it like our country so great is we do have all these people from different places and different backgrounds, different religions, different schools of thought. I think that's something that's feel like is lost right now. We want everyone to think a certain way. Like I like hearing different people's perspectives politically or musically or like sports or what, like everything. I'm just like, oh, you're like a diehard Lions fan. Okay. That's really interesting. Like tell me about bastards. Yeah. So I don't know. I like that diversity of all of it.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Chuck, because you're right. Like everybody's talking about diversity nowadays, but they're talking about it like just at a very like base level of our complexions and how our hair is and whatnot, which I think really does not do justice to the complexity of human life. So I actually do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion training, but it's not the conventional type that has unfortunately come to be prominent of where everybody's kind of like branded with racial identities and then saddled with the consequences of those racial identities,
Mhm.
whether you're an oppressor or you're oppressed or things like that. To me, the most important diversity of all is diversity of thought, because that diversity of thought is what proves the value of diversity, first of all. In that, if you're making a case in a corporate setting, like, why does my company need to be diverse? Well, if you got 10 people from all the same background, all grew up in the same town, and they're all looking at a problem, you're going to have a lot more varied perspectives on how to solve a problem if you had 10 people from each corner of the earth looking at the same problem, because you have a much wider pool to draw from of experience to apply to this problem, to solve it, to innovate. So just from a business sense, it makes a lot of sense to have that diversity. But again, even when you're talking about that, you're not talking about, well, you have 10 people who don't look the same. You're just, when you're fixated on that physical aspect, you're losing the importance of the thought aspect.
Mhm.
And the thought aspect is what proves the fallacy of race. Like, you and I don't think and act alike because we have a similar complexion, and that goes for whether your complexion is light, dark, or whatever. And I spend a lot of time with people who don't look like me, and I listen to them all. And when I listen to them all, I find that there are all sorts of different perspectives on every single issue that our society is concerned about. And I think it's really important that we humble ourselves and maybe step outside of our own ideological boxes a little bit, to understand that someone else's lived experience can lead them to a place where what they think makes a lot of sense doesn't make sense to us. And that's okay. Like,
Mhm.
that's what diversity is. That's literally going back to the example of 10 people. That's why you want a diverse organization. So when we're talking about diversity, let's talk about diversity of thought, and let's encourage that. At the same time, making sure that, there's a fair degree of representation and inclusion in what we're doing.
Sure, I love it. That's great. Well, so like with prevention now, because I know like a lot of what your organization does is you try to like kind of rescue people from the white supremacy and white nationalist groups and things like that. But like, what about just preventing it from happening in the first place? And you say like hurt people. So it doesn't necessarily have to be. It was interesting at the beginning you brought up jihad. I was like, that's a really good point, because that's like a similar kind. It's hate. It's hate. And so how can you just help kids go, like, what would have helped you to think go down a different path, and that would have nothing to do with hurting people? Is there something that you think can help kids and teenagers?
Yeah, in a broad sense, it's essentially helping people uh, deal with trauma that they've incurred in their life, and process it in a healthy way. So I'm a Buddhist nowadays, and like Buddhism 101 is, if you live, you suffer. Like, that's
I
gonna
agree with
happen.
that. Yeah.
Not a whole lot of getting around that, but understanding like where the suffering comes from. In Buddhism, we believe a lot of our suffering comes from our attachments. Like, if I didn't have an attachment to being warm and comfortable in my house in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in April, I I wouldn't suffer if I did. If I could deal, if I could somehow elevate myself above this need to be physically comfortable. Um, but it's, if we can help people find healthy ways to process their trauma, the likelihood of that trauma being transferred to someone else, i.e., hurt people, is diminished. So in my case, and a really important point is that, as amazing as humanity is, one of the most amazing things is that although we have all this commonality and we have way more in common than different, at the same time, we are, every single one of us, all 8 billion some odd people on this planet, are unique individuals. That and not, no two are alike. We, even identical twins raised in the identical environment, don't aren't identical when it comes down to their thoughts and their preferences and things like that. So respecting that individuality, we need to understand that what works for me as a kid might not work for another kid. So
Hmm.
we need to have a broad offering of ways for people to process trauma in a healthy way. So the arts are a go-to means of that. All forms of art, Music is another way that people can process trauma. In my case, I think sports is another way.
Hmm.
I think martial arts would have been a saving grace for me. Had my parents, I lived in this rich suburb where we were the poor kids, and all my rich friends all took taekwondo and karate, and I was like really jealous and like obsessed with all things remotely martial arts related, and my parents couldn't afford that. So
Oh.
it had I been able to like really get into a good martial arts program and stay in it, I think that would have been the right outlet for my aggressions while building like a real genuine sense of self-worth and value. The other element in preventing violent extremism beyond the hurt people piece is that there are basic human needs that violent extremist groups will prey upon to bring people into their groups. And depending where you are in the world, those
Hmm.
needs may be higher or lower on Maslow's hierarchy.
Oh,
So
okay.
in places in Africa and the Middle East, there's some places where people don't have food and water and shelter. And so ISIS or El Shabaab will come and say, "Yeah, we'll give you those things, but you're going to come fight for us." So that's an example of exploiting a very low level base need of a human being. In the so-called Western world, in North America, in Europe, the circumstances of people who don't have those base needs taken care of are much fewer. You're not going to find as many people in
Right.
that situation. So
Didn't you find kids who were bullied or something? Isn't that a big part of how you?
exactly. So we're looking at like those higher level needs that are exploited in that hierarchy, and those are a need for identity, a need for purpose, and a need for
Hmm.
belonging. Those are three basic human needs that all human beings have.
Mm-hmm.
Most human beings find a healthy way to answer those needs. Again, it might be art, music, sports, activism, academics, whatever. But if you don't have a healthy answer to those needs, violent extremist ideology can swoop in and be like, here's your identity, here's your purpose, here's your belonging. And so, a way to prevent violent extremism is to institute programs in schools that cultivate healthy answers to those needs. One of the programs I'm involved with is called Serve to Unite, and it basically does that through arts-driven service learning and global engagement. So we would ask kids in high school, middle school, like, "Hey, what do we need to fix in this society?" And there's no shortage of answers for that. And there's over the years, our students have addressed like every issue in society you can imagine. And what we do is we like facilitate a solution based approach to that problem. So, for instance, after Mike Brown was killed by a police officer in St. Louis, a lot of our students were like, we want to address this issue between community and police. Well, the way we did that was we brought uniformed cops into the classrooms and developed a way that the kids could anonymously ask these cops whatever the questions they wanted to ask. And they were difficult questions like,
Hmm.
why is it always brown and black people getting shot? Why are there more cops in my neighborhood than this other neighborhood? Everything you ever wanted to ask a cop but were afraid to. And the police would very frankly answer these things from their own perspective and also from the perspective of the police department in a broader sense. And what ended up happening was we had a dialogue between cops and kids so they could really both see the humanity in each other and both kind
Hmm.
of understand where each other were coming from. And
Right.
then we had a live drawer like do a mural of the whole thing as the discussion was going on. And then that mural became part of an exhibit that went around the city, basically saying like this kind of dialogue is possible. This is the benefits of having it. Let's do it more often.
Wow, I love that because I feel like right now the problem is it's either blamed on the police 100% or it's blamed on black people 100%. It's either, blue lives matter, black lives matter. And it's like, I don't think it's, forgive the term, I don't think it's a black and white, right? I think
right.
like, there could be better training for police for
Totally.
sure. And there could be better training for citizens and not just black people. All citizens, like kids, like being taught how to like get arrested, what happens when you get pulled over? Like, I don't think I knew this until maybe my 20s or 30s, but when you get pulled over, you're supposed to put your hands on the wheel. Most
Right.
people try to go into their glove box because they're trying to get their registration and stuff.
Right.
That makes the cop nervous because they don't know if you're reaching for a gun or something. So they want you to have your hands on the steering wheel. So when they walk up, they know where your hands are. And then they'll tell you, get your registration or whatever. Like they'll tell you what to do so they can see what you're doing. So like little things like that, I feel like we could teach our citizens. I love the idea of the dialogue. That's like,
Totally.
why isn't that something that, and what are your thoughts on just how the media handles these kinds of situations? Because what you're saying, a dialogue, I don't hear that on either side about the media talking about that.
Yeah, I don't either as much as I'd like. Regarding media, and I'm very I want to be very intentional and mindful about how I talk about media, because
Yeah.
as a white nationalist 30 years ago,
Yeah.
we would never say the word media. It would always be the Jewish media. Like that was how you had to say that. And you had to cast it as this Jewish propaganda machine. And it's funny because nowadays, if you're talking to someone on the far right, they won't say media either. They'll say the liberal media. And they do it in the exact same kind of dynamic that we did with saying Jewish media. And if you talk to someone on the far left, they'll say the corporate media,
Fox News. They'll say Fox News.
The white supremacist capitalist oppressor media, or what. It always has to be qualified in that way. What's really interesting is they both, according to either poll, the New York Times is the devil. The righties, it's so liberal, blah blah blah. The lefties are like, it's corporate capitalist, blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, well, that's a good sign for me that I'm going to be more, that this media outlet has a little more objectivity, and that they piss off everybody. But that is kind of
the goal of media in general, though. I think this is what people forget. I think the goal of media used to be to report the news, but I think what had happened was there's so many media outlets, it got more competitive. And I feel like now their goal is to make money, and they don't make money if people aren't watching and fearful. And so I feel like both sides, I mean, you could tell me I'm wrong, but I feel like both sides try to pump in fear. It's just, what's your brand of fear? Are you scared of COVID? Are you scared of, white supremacy? Are you scared of, jihad terrorists? I mean, they're going to try to pump something to scare you, so you keep watching.
I totally agree with you. That's what it boils down to nowadays. It's all clickbait. Like that's how they get paid. I had a years ago, I forget what the whole context was, but some reporter reached out to me asking about white nationalists and guns. And we did I was on the phone with them for an hour. I told them everything about back in the day, we were all armed to the teeth and blah, blah, blah. And then a week later, this guy produces a headline that says former white nationalist says white nationalist groups are arming themselves to execute gay people. And I'm like, what? That's not what I told you by any stretch. I did not indicate that, but they kind of twisted everything I had. This hour-long talk of all this context. They just strip it all to get this really sensational clickbaity headline. That's not helping anybody. It's not certainly not helping gay people to tell them that there's white supremacists around every corner and under every rock waiting to shoot them. And yet this is, and you're right, all media does this, whether it's right wing or left wing. They all do this bullshit clickbait practice. That's how they make money. And it's sad. It's intimidating. But my take on the media is my same as the take on government, in that I believe both the media and the government are manifestations of our collective social consciousness. And if our collective social consciousness is one of fear and loathing and distrust and separatism, that's what we're going to get from both of these things. They're essentially mirrors. And media, more so now than ever before. CNN, Fox News, whatever, they pull their stories from what's trending on Twitter or what's trending on, whatever social media platform. So we're literally telling them what we want to see, and they're just showing it to us. So in order to sort this out, and it's unfortunately not an easy answer, but I think we all, and again, this is my Buddhism speaking, but I think we all need to start inward and like look at our relationship with ourselves and make peace with ourselves and generate a sense of inner peace. And only from there can you work to build outer peace. If you have this constant turmoil within yourself where you don't trust yourself, you won't forgive yourself, you hate yourself at times, you're greedy, you're jealous, you're scared, like how are you supposed to go function with other people without addressing those issues first?
Right. And then I think the next step would be to go out into the world and talk to people. Cause that's what I love to travel. I don't know about you, but like I love to travel.
Love to.
And one of my favorite things about traveling is like going to a restaurant or a bar or somewhere, just anywhere, store, and just talking to people that live there or people that are visiting there, and just talking to different people from different backgrounds and just hearing all sorts of things. And then you're like, oh, okay. Like I thought, like I remember going down to the South, and I was really interested because I was like, I hear all these things. The South is so racist. So I'm thinking I'm going to go down the South. I'm seeing all these, I'm going to see all these Confederate flags and like, terrible racist things. And I mean, I saw a couple things that really made me cringe, but by and large, it was like not a lot of racist stuff. Most of the people I talked to didn't appear racist. I mean, maybe they go into their homes and to say different things, but I mean, they seem like really good people. It was very interesting. I had this stereotype in my mind of Southern people, and it was the real South that I visited did not fit that at all.
I'm so with you, Chuck. Totally with you. I love to travel. Paraphrasing Mark Twain, he had a great quote saying that something to the effect of travel is the cure for prejudice. And I truly believe that. And to emphasize further what you said, that aspect of interacting with people face to face is absolutely irreplaceable. Mm-hmm. And it's so vital. I think that our salvation lies in that personal interaction. I had actually I shut down my Facebook account a couple of years ago in the summer of 20, actually, because things were just getting so ridiculous. I'm like, I have a life to live. I can't be on Facebook all the time, like ping ponging back and forth between the angry lefties and the angry righties. And I find that the more I get away from social media, I still do Instagram, and it's octopus pictures and cat pictures and food pictures and surfing and maybe some girly pictures here and there. But I'm not into the politics, and I'm not into all the fighting and whatnot. But I find that social media tends to distort our lens that we see other people through. Whereas on social media, I'm just like, oh, that guy's profile, yep, he's a Trumper. Yeah, he's got some bullshit to say, or this person's a big wokester. They're gonna have some bullshit to say. And when you just meet someone face to face,
yeah,
and you don't know where they're coming from politically, right, and you just have a conversation with them. Then if you later find out, like, oh my God, they vote for that guy who I think is the devil incarnate, but they're nice. They're like good people. Like what now you're starting to see the complexity of life. And, right, and you have some buy-in, you got some skin in the game in your actual interaction with this person to try to understand them. And I think if once we stop trying to understand people, like we're gonna be pretty screwed.
No, that's exactly right. So, and I think one of the reasons I reached out to you, because I was just like, I keep hearing like white supremacy, white nationalists. Like I keep hearing a lot of those words being thrown around. And I was like, I want to talk to someone who was actually in this organization, like what actually was a white supremacist. So you have a different perspective. I mean, again, we're two white people talking, so we don't know what it's like to be a minority or experience racism, but your perspective as coming from like being in the white supremacist organizations to like the world now, like, how race is that? Have things gotten worse or better or the same in terms of racism? Because I feel like, I don't know what to think. Sometimes I think like we've come so far, and then other times I feel like we're going backwards.
So first off, and you make a good point. Like it's high time that race and racism wasn't just like strictly defined by a bunch of white people deciding what that's going to mean and all that. But
I would love to have somebody from a minority that is in an organization or something that come on my show. I mean, anybody's welcome on my show. I'm not going to discriminate, but I did want to get your perspective on it, just because you've seen the full on, like these are people that, they want to, white power for everything. And then now you're seeing like the real world right now with the news is white supremacy. Is it just more underground? Is it like, I mean, a lot of things get labeled white supremacy, and I want to know like what you're like, do you feel like that is white supremacy? Like some people think like anybody that voted for Trump is a white supremacist. And I don't know what, like, I want to hear your thoughts on that. You froze. Oh, there you go.
All right, we're back.
Yeah.
Discussion in this area that everything I have to say on the subject of white supremacy, of course, it's informed by my past and my experience, but it's informed from listening to people who don't look like me. Mm-hmm. So what I have to say is not like from my privilege bubble or my toxic fragile whiteness or whatever buzzword is being thrown around about it. It's from
those are buzzwords. You're right.
Who don't look like me. And along those lines, there's a brilliant book called Racecraft. The subtitle is The Soul of Inequality in American Life. It's written by two world-renowned sociologists who are Afro-American. Their names are Karen and Barbara Fields. And their position in racecraft is they name it racecraft to make a comparison between race and witchcraft. And that they're both like concocted ideologies that somehow hold like way greater sway on our society than they should. And their position basically is that race is bullshit. There's no scientific basis for it. Any anthropologist will tell you that. The whole thing about lighter skin, darker skin, the shape of your nose, your head, whatever, those are all phenotypes. It's just they're genetic traits that determine how we look. They don't determine how we think. They shouldn't determine our place in society. They shouldn't determine our worth or our value. And in racecraft, they make the point that white supremacy has never been about simply white people being in charge. It has always been about which white people are in charge. So to that end, a good example of this is pre-Civil War South, 8% of white people owned slaves. The other 92% were certainly better off than enslaved Africans, but not by a whole lot. If you had a hierarchy or a spectrum of all the populace of the white or of the South pre-Civil War, you would have the enslaved Africans, the so-called free whites, and then way up here are the 8% who are plantation owners. So again, this is way more of a class thing than it's a race thing. And the idea of white supremacy is, first of all, and this is something that gets lost way too often nowadays. When people talk about white supremacy now, it seems almost as if they believe it. That they believe that white people are different and that white people are superior enough to dominate the entire planet. I don't believe that. I believe white supremacy is bullshit. It's a lie from day one, and it's a lie today. And the real two foundational lies of it are first of all that like there is some kind of homogenous white hive mind and that all white people act in each other's interests, which is not true. It's never been true. Going back to police violence, there are slightly more unarmed white people killed every year by police than actual unarmed black people. It's a much smaller percentage of the population, and that's a huge issue. But the point I want to make is name me one white person who got killed by police in the past 10 years. Like, no one can. You can rattle off a big long list, all like Mike Brown, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. You just go on and on and on. And every one of those incidents were atrocities. But the point is because there is no white solidarity, because white people don't go, oh my God, a white person got shot, I'm going to go march. Like, I'm going to go protest. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen, and it's never happened. Even if you go back to the founding of this country, George Washington signed a naturalization law in 1790 that said you could become a naturalized citizen of the United States only if you are a land-owning white man. It wasn't, hey, anyone white can come in here and be naturalized. It's like, no, you have to own land and be white.
Huh.
So that's classically
Interesting.
that's how white supremacy has worked. The lie of it is that, hey, all white people are together. They're all going to look out for white people and work for white people's interests. That was the establishing lie of white supremacy, and it's still a lie today. In that, I worked with a guy in rural Georgia who I helped get out of the Klan. The guy who did this tattoo. That guy can't go walking into the board of Northwestern Mutual Life and like expect to get a job because he's white. Like he's a poor redneck, who's just coming off a methamphetamine addiction, and he doesn't have all these advantages that everybody's like casting on him because of the color of his skin. So that this presents a problem as far all sorts of problems like across the board. But we're going back to white nationalism. The biggest problem it presents there is that there's essentially two steps to create a white nationalist. Step one is the potential recruit has to identify as white. And believe it or not, in the late 80s, most so-called white people didn't. If I went up to Joe pissed off white kid and said, "Hey, white man," he'd be like, "Well, I'm American. My grandpa was from Germany. Like we're Lutheran. Like they're not going to necessarily identify themselves as white by default. So I need to get them to do that before I can get them to step two, which is to make them feel persecuted because they're white. So nowadays, tragically, a lot of very well-meaning people are walking through those first two steps. We have people like lecturing the Congress of the United States going, "You're white and everything wrong with this country is your fault because you're oppressors and you're privileged and you're fragile and you're benefiting from racism." So now they're doing the exact same process that I did to recruit white nationalists. And this is an attitude that is becoming prevalent in our schools. To where everybody's being divided along racial lines, and everyone's being kind of taught to think in these racial terms. When the truth is, as I understand it, is the more racialized the society is, the more conducive it is to actual white nationalist groups, and the more the constructs that support actual white supremacy are supported. So I think white supremacy sucks. I think it's a lie, and I think race sucks also. And so I'm very intentional about not doing anything to maintain those constructs. At the same time, we need to bear witness to the suffering that race has caused for 500 years. We can't just go, "Hey, that's all over now," and slap our fingers and be, "Hey, race is done." Like you can't. You have to look at history with openness and with honesty, and admit that it's been written by the victors, and there's a lot of people whose voices haven't been heard in a historical perspective. But I think the impetus for doing that is because those voices are our fellow human beings. That's why we need to bear witness to that suffering, not because those voices are a certain color. And maintaining this construct of race that is the foundation of the problem in the first place.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, because that's what I just see. Like, it's both sides. It's like they're painting this picture, and I would rather just if everyone could just treat people good, regardless of. And I think that goes back to what I was saying when you go out and you actually interact with people of different backgrounds or races or religions or whatever, like you'll see, like, it's kind of like what you realized when you were, I think that was a point in your book when you were dropping your daughter off at school and you saw people of other races with their kids and you saw like, oh, they're just like me. I love my daughter. My daughter loves me, just like this black guy with his son I could have hurt these people. And why would I do that? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. And that's why connecting on that human level, and that's how we bear witness to the suffering. Right now, we're kind of told like, well, you have to bear witness to their suffering because they're black. where I'm like, well, they're suffering because people call them black for 500 years, when really they're human beings like we are. And
Mhm.
that's why all this horror
Yeah.
of slavery and genocide and colonialism and imperialism is
Right.
wrong, is because we're all human beings, not because race is real and race is valid. Race isn't valid.
Right.
It's as
Well,
bullshit as witchcraft is.
I don't think anyone's going to deny the racist history of our country. I mean, but it's just interesting to me because everybody has a different opinion or perspective or a different life. Even with black people within black people, like there's
Oh,
black
totally.
people that I hear that say they've never experienced racism, which I'm like suspicious of. And then there's black people that see the world as completely, totally racist. And so you have to like take everyone's perspective differently, right? And I mean, I think like
Exactly.
it goes back to what you're saying too about the class. I mean, I think that's a bigger indicator than race, right? I mean, if you grew up as a rich black person or a poor white person, that's going to be very different.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I'm very much a capitalist. I feel that capitalism it's imperfect, and it certainly has its warts. And there's all sorts of things that can improve as far as capitalism goes. I'm a big fan of the idea of conscious capitalism, and I like seeing the private sector becoming a lot more mindful about the impacts of what doing business is, and looking to make sure that everybody gets a better piece of it. But I'm about creating wealth rather than redistributing it. And at the same time,
I love that.
I do acknowledge and I understand a lot of the people that I cite that I'm listening to, i.e., Karen and Barbara Fields, are very left leaning. The Field sisters are basically very close to straight up Marxist, but that's their point they're making, is that class and not race has been the driving factor behind slavery and everything else for the past 500 years. So I again, this is an example of me listening to someone who I don't politically jibe with entirely, but we can both see like the same root causes of what's happening here. And that's how I think problems get solved. So like you said, you got to listen to people and understand that not everyone thinks it's that way because of how they look, and a lot of times if you listen to people, you're going to be really surprised. As you read in Gift of Our Wounds, one of my closest friends is a Punjabi man named Pardeep Singh Kaleka. Pardeep's a Sikh, and a lot of people would say Sikh.
I was going to say, isn't it Sikh?
It's actually Sikh. In Punjabi,
okay.
in Punjabi, they pronounce it Sikh the same way we would say, I got sick, whatever. But with Pardeep, him and I do a lot of talks together, and one of our things is we always will stop in at the local Sikh temple wherever we're speaking. And part of the Sikh faith is a communal meal called langar. And it's always like amazing vegetarian Indian food, which I'm not a vegetarian, but it's always great food. And I'm like, yeah, if there's langar, I'm there. Like, let's go sit down and eat and talk. And the last one we did was at the Gurdwara in Orlando. And there at the Gurdwara, there were a bunch of Sikhs there who were all like kind of in biker get-ups with like the vests and all the patches and whatnot. They told us that they're from the Sikh Riders of America. And I'm like, oh, cool. I personally hate Harley Davidsons because I don't like intentionally loud vehicles. But
Yeah.
I'm not going to hold that against these guys. They're awesome guys. They ride all over the country together. They have big rides of hundreds and thousands of people, and they do all kinds of charity stuff. They raise money for like women's shelters, and they do a lot of great work. And as I'm talking to one of these guys, I moved to tell the story about how much my father loves his Sikh dentist in Astoria, or his Sikh doctor in Astoria, Oregon. And I'm very used to being in like social justice-y, left-leaning circles. So anytime I'm going to talk about my dad, I'm just kind of conditioned to be like, well, he's a big Trumper, but but let me explain like how he's still a nice guy. That's kind of where I'm always coming from. And as I'm talking to this guy about this, he's like, well, I'm a big Trumper. And I'm like, oh shit, what? I don't know. He's like, yeah, I think Donald Trump's great. And he goes on to tell me that and I again, I didn't want to like get into the whole thing with him. I didn't want to explain like why I think Donald Trump's not great, but I did want to hear this guy's thoughts, and his exact words were that he never felt as included and as part of the United States society as when Donald Trump was president. And this is a brown dude with a big beard and a turban.
Huh.
Like that's and I tell this story to like my progressive friends who are, many of whom are white, and they're like, what? No. Like, yeah, it's true. This is exactly what he said.
Yeah,
and
that's what I'm saying. Everybody's got a different perspective,
and we got to respect
it's all over
that.
the place. It's like people assume, okay, this person is this race or this religion. They must think this way. They must have this political party, and it doesn't always match up that way. I think that's just as dangerous as as being a racist. Absolutely. I mean, that is racist in a way, isn't it? I mean, to assume somebody's totally background is a certain way, or
it totally is, and that's what we need to move beyond. And one of the points I like to make to my liberal friends, and I'm if I needed to be pigeonholed politically, I'd call myself a left-leaning moderate. Like,
okay, I thought you said at one point, I thought I heard you say on a podcast or in your book or somewhere, you said far left. So I was like, oh, maybe you've come more to the middle.
I did my college stint from 2007 to 2010, and I was a community education major. And so I came out of college all like, yeah, fuck white privilege and all your blah, 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 blah. I'm an anti-racist. And then I like get out in the real world, start listening to people, start working in the real world and seeing like, oh, that approach not only does it not help, a lot of times it makes things worse.
Right.
And
well, I think if you're extreme on any side is bad. Like, totally. It's so interesting that you went from white supremacist to campaigning for Obama. I'm like reading your book and I'm just like, wow, this is so fascinating. And then, but then you kind of realize you're like, well, actually, I don't know that Obama, he didn't really live up to my expectation. Like you thought he was going to like save things and change a lot of things. And it wasn't as great as you thought.
Right. Yeah. So, I don't think to this day, I don't think a lot of that is Obama's fault. I think it's just the state. It's the political condition itself.
Sure. But politicians in general are not, nobody should worship any politician.
Exactly. And there's no politician who's going to come in and just be like, woo, everything is fixed. Like, and Obama got me thinking that was possible. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think like aspiration is very, very important. But at the same time, when we get tunnel vision and being like, okay, Obama's the answer and everybody who doesn't like him is the devil, like now who do we sound like?
Now it sounds like the Trump people that say Trump is the answer and anyone who doesn't like him is terrible.
Exactly.
So it's like, yeah.
Going back to like that's the kind of the point I want to make to people, in that I've had Trumpers tell me that I have Trump derangement syndrome, which apparently means that I'm mentally ill because I don't like their boy, and that's basically, it's gaslighting. It's saying like, oh, you're crazy if you think this way, you're mentally ill, you're crazy. And when I talk about this to people on the left, they're like, yeah, all those horrible Trumpers, and I'm like, you know what? Let me tell you a story about the Punjabi guys who think Trump's awesome. And then they go, oh, well, they must have internalized oppression. and now they have their own version of gaslighting these people who don't fit their ideological box. And I was just having this discussion in San Diego at the film screening, and they're like, well, yeah, no, but there's valid science behind internalized oppression. I'm like, no, there's not. It is every bit as much bullshit as Trump derangement syndrome. Right.
Well, isn't it? But see, I always try to learn from people. I try to.
Thank you.
Because on the right, you've got like the QAnon people, which is. That's like almost, that's like not even just a philosophy. That's like you're reading false information a lot of times. And then on the left, you've got like the Marxists and stuff. But I try to listen to people. I mean, I have friends who I don't know that they would fall into either one of those categories, but I have conservative friends and I have, people who voted for Bernie Sanders and stuff. And I try to understand where they're coming from. And I think it helps me to go to come really right back to more to the middle. I just keep coming back to the middle.
Absolutely. I'm with you too. That's going back to my spiritual foundation. Like Buddhism is known as the middle path in many ways, and ironically, amongst Buddhists, there's a lot of them who are like, no, we need to be woke and liberate our people of color, brothers and sisters. But they're like, okay, well, that's not how I interpret it, but that's all right. There's very right wing leaning Buddhists also. My dad being one of them. So it's no one has all the answers. We just got to listen to each other, learn from each other, and if not occupy the middle, like create some more space in the middle where people can be, and stop this whole like you're with us or you're against us.
Right.
Ultimatum.
Instead of trying to convince somebody to believe what you believe, try to understand what they believe and why they believe it.
Exactly.
I think that's because you'll learn. To me, that's why I do the podcast, partly because I like hearing people's different perspectives, people's different life stories. I mean, I was telling my girlfriend yesterday, I was like, I hope people don't think like, you know, I have too many white people on my show. I don't really think of that because like it's probably because a lot of musicians and stuff. But I was like, I feel, you know, I'd love to have more people of different backgrounds and more women too. I have a lot of white men, but I love hearing people's different stories. And this has been a lot of fun listening to your stories and your background and your perspectives on things. I think it's really eye-opening. And it sounds like you're doing a lot of great work.
Thanks, Chuck. I appreciate it. Yeah, I do a number of directions nowadays, but the main one is I work with a group called Parents for Peace. People can find out more about them at parentsforpeace.org with the number 4. Parents for Peace is a resource for anyone who's concerned about a loved one getting mixed up in any kind of violent extremism. We have the lead white nationalist interventionist for Parents for Peace is a man named Chris Buckley, the guy who did this tattoo for me, who I helped to get out of the Klan in 2016. So now his main job, his full-time job, is assisting people to get out of hate groups and assisting their loved ones also. And Chris works very closely with another dear friend of mine named Mubin Sheikh, who's a former jihadi. And Mubin is the lead for people getting mixed up in violent Islamist groups. And it's amazing to see how Chris and Mubin like work as a team to show the similarities behind those ideologies.
Yeah. I never thought of that, but you're right. Those are two very similar things, which is like, you don't hear that. Because like if you're looking at what news channel you watch, it's like they're going to paint one group as the other. They're both bad groups. I think we can all agree on that. So you're doing some great work. I will put that website in the show notes. Can people donate to that? Is it a charity or? Yeah.
So Parents for Peace is a federally recognized 501c3. Donations to Parents for Peace are fully tax deductible, and it helps to pay the salary of people like Chris and Mubin. So if people aren't in a position to financially support, that's huge. Again, parentsforpeace.org with the number 4. There's also a toll-free national helpline there that people can call to get help if they're worried about a loved one or if they need help themselves.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, I think, again, you're doing great work. I appreciate you taking the time to come on my show, and I'll get this episode out soon.
Sounds great, Chuck. Thanks again for having me on.
All right, thanks. I'll talk to you later.
Cheers.
Bye. Well, wow, just wow. You know, I wanted to keep it going, but I didn't want to take any more of Arno's time. He was extremely generous with his time, and I hope to have him back on the show because, again, for as long as we talked and as much as we covered, I feel like there was a lot more to discuss. But what are your thoughts? Let me know. I'd love to hear your opinions. Write me a comment on social media or on YouTube, or send me a private message if you feel more comfortable with that. Or you can reach out to Arno if you have a question for him. But check out his books. He has 2 books, My Life After Hate and The Gift of Our Wounds. And the last one is also on Audible, and you can listen to that just like you listen to this podcast. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Check out some of my other episodes. I've had on some other authors, and I hope to have on more authors and people like this to discuss social issues because I find it fascinating. So make sure to subscribe so that you can catch future episodes. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great rest of your day, and remember to shoot for the moon.